Okay, so this session, upon popular demand from many of our low-income residents I know, is on public housing in a changing landscape. And I will introduce our panelists. Directly to my left is Susan Popkin, Senior Fellow and Director of the Neighborhoods and Youth Development Initiative at the Urban Institute, and author of No Simple Solutions, Transforming Public Housing in Chicago. I have a copy right here, which I read and loved every page of, so I encourage you to pick it up. And then next to my left is Martha Weatherspoon, President, Lincoln Home Residential Council in Clarksville, Tennessee, and also an NLIHC board member. And then next to my left is Shauna Sorrells, Director of Legislative and Public Affairs at the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, Maryland. And then just next to her is not Shola Olatoye. Doesn't look anything like Shola. So a little story here is that Shola went to the airport at 6 a.m. this morning to get on a flight from New York to DC, and the flight was canceled. And then she tried to get on the next flight, and it was canceled. She got bumped or whatever. Tried to finally get on the 9 o'clock flight, thinking she could get here at least halfway through this session. And then something happened with that flight as well. So unfortunately, she was not able to attend. But fortunately for us, we have David Pristin, Executive Vice President of External Affairs for the New York City Housing Authority, which, by the way, is the largest housing authority in the country. So just a couple of comments to get us started. There are 1.1 million households that live in public housing. 2.6 million individuals. 33% of household heads of those households are seniors. 20% are non-elderly individuals with disabilities. About 40% are families with children. The average income of a household in public housing is $14,000 a year. And 80%, so 8 out of 10 households have incomes below $20,000 a year. So that's the population we're talking about. Many folks in this room are residents of public housing. And public housing has been woefully underfunded for many, many years. The capital needs are estimated to be about $50 billion needed in repairs to public housing across the country. And it's also estimated that we lose 10,000 units of public housing every year. Okay, so this book, No Simple Solutions, Transforming Public Housing in Chicago, is not only a fascinating read, but a really provocative, thought-provoking primer on a discussion about public housing in a changing landscape. So I'm going to ask Sue Popkin to start us off with some reflections.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the endorsement. I've been thinking a lot about the book, which came out just before the election, so I thought it was going to be speaking to a different policy landscape than the one we're in, but then what lessons does it have for where we are now? And one that I would start with is, this is a book about the last time we disinvested in public housing and what happened because of that. Because the public housing in Chicago got in such terrible condition because of decades of mismanagement, disinvestment, HUD neglect, local neglect. And one of the things I worry a lot about is that we are on the verge of repeating that cycle. And it wasn't just Chicago, it was all over the country, but I was in Chicago. If you read the book, like 30 years ago, I was hanging around Chicago as a graduate student and got to follow what happened there. The book was sort of a rare opportunity to reflect back on what I'd done and what I'd learned. And I think to think back about how bad it really was, I think one of the debates over the last 10 years has been the concern about replacing public housing with mixed income housing, and should we be demolishing this public housing? And I think it's important to start by remembering just how bad it was in Chicago in the 80s and early 90s. I remember being in a development in Chicago in the early 90s where the incinerator had backed up to the 7th floor of a 15-story building. You can imagine what that smell was like, and people were trying to live there with their kids. The elevators weren't working. Everything was covered with graffiti. The rats were visible. I mean, it was just not a place where people should have to live. And that is, I think, important as the benchmark of where we were. It was the worst of public housing in the United States, but it wasn't the only place that was in terrible condition at that point. And HUD took over the Housing Authority in 1995 when the Clinton administration decided they were going to turn around public housing and make it show that it could be an asset for communities, which by that they meant mostly, as you know, the shift to mixed income. I think the HUD receivership in Chicago had some pretty profound effects that were important. Among other things, they cleaned up the books. They hadn't been collecting rent, it turned out, for I don't know how long. So they cleaned up the books. They were able to document where everybody was, and they set the stage for the demolitions that came afterwards. And I do think by the time HUD took over the Housing Authority in 1995, there was really no alternative to taking down those buildings. They were built so badly and in such poor condition. There just was no fixing them wasn't going to be plausible at that point. The city launched, or the Housing Authority launched what they called the Plan for Transformation in October 1999. It is also officially the Housing Authority's Moving to Work plan, and HUD and the mayor had to agree to it. And the Housing Authority returned to local control at that point. It called for demolishing all 11 of the high-rise family developments, rehabbing the senior and small family properties. It is still not complete. That happened in 1999. One of the things I've been reflecting on is why did it stall? Because it was moving along for a while. And there's been quite a lot of recent news about the stalling in Chicago. The challenges for the plan were daunting. It was a vast scale. It was huge cost. It was billions of dollars to replace all those developments. Even after the HUD takeover, the CHA still lacked capacity. It was a dysfunctional agency, had been for a long time. And there was also the reality. Conditions were terrible, but it was still home for the residents. They didn't want to go, they didn't ask to go, so it was involuntary relocation, and there had not been a lot of thought about what that would mean and how residents should be treated in the process. I think one of the things that I think a lot of us who were watching what was happening, including me and other researchers, expected it to be a complete disaster, and in fact the early stages were. They were doing just a terrible job with relocation, and people they were basically just moving them from one falling down building to another. But after 10 years, in fact, a lot of things had improved. They had developed a very refined relocation system and a counseling system, a supportive wraparound services for residents. And we were tracking families who were being moved and finding out what was happening to them. And I'd say it came out better than I ever would have predicted at the beginning, at least at 10 to 15 years in. The biggest success is there is no child in Chicago who's living in a place as bad as those places were in 1995. And I think it's important to remember. It's still only a partial victory. Nearly all the residents moved to other poor African-American neighborhoods. And I think one of the other things I like to note is there, especially now with the rise in homicide in Chicago, people like to claim that it was tearing down the projects that's caused the crime in Chicago to rise. The Housing Authority actually asked us to study that question. There is no evidence that that's the case. And by this point, it's been 15 years anyway. I think it's happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So most of the residents ended up in better housing in safer neighborhoods. They were not lost. There was not a spike in homelessness. The Housing Authority, because there was a lot of oversight, actually can account for almost everybody who was there. I think that things have not been going as smoothly for the last 5 years, and I'll talk about the end why I think that is. Mostly what I did was focus on what happened to the families. So at the time I stopped tracking them, which was about 6 years ago now, about 17% of them were in the new mixed income housing. I think that number has dropped over time. About a third had moved to other CHA developments that had been rehabbed, and the rest had taken vouchers and moved to other neighborhoods around the city. Less than 1% of the legal leaseholders ended up homeless. I think that if there was a rise in homelessness, it would probably because there were so many squatters living in the developments when they came down. One of the other interesting things, and I think holds a lot of lessons for the policy debate we have right now, that along the way, the Housing Authority transformed into a much more functional agency than it had been, and I ended up partnering with them on a demonstration about how they could provide much more intensive wraparound services to their residents. And they were really getting worried about 2005 about the people they had been moving from one building to another because they weren't qualifying for replacement housing, and we ended up collaborating with them on a services demonstration that was very successful and included mental health services and case management, and people's health improved and their mental health improved and their employment went up, and they relocated successfully, and that was great and lasted for a couple of years afterwards. Did not benefit their kids in the way that we had hoped, and I've ended up partnering with them on a second demonstration, which is continuing around how do you do this for the whole family. So they become a housing authority that innovates at least around resident services, and really thinking about the next generation. But I think when I think about the lessons for where we are now, I worry a lot about the outcomes for that study, because although people were working more, they were certainly not earning enough to earn their way off public housing. The Housing Authority has put resident services in all of its family developments now. They've had a work requirement that came along with the plan for transformation. They mostly use it to get people into the resident services. They have not been evicting people because of the work requirement. They don't want to be evicting people because of the work requirement. They want to be helping people move into education and work with it. They are very worried about the prospect for time limits or being put in a situation where they would have to use it as an eviction tool. And I think that there is no evidence that a compliance-oriented work requirement is going to help solve people's housing problems and enable to afford housing in the private market. I think the other lesson I see here is that one of the reasons this was as successful as it was because of the civic commitment at the local level. Mayor Daley was not going to have the people going homeless on his watch. There has not been that same level of commitment the last 5 years. I think there's a renewed interest because of some of the controversy that's been happening. I think that's really important to have that kind of local activism and oversight, researchers, activists, advocates, because otherwise if people aren't paying attention, it's very easy for the housing to go down and people not to end up better off. So I think that's what I'm worrying, those are the things I'm worrying about now.
Fantastic. I know that you have lots of questions. We're going to hold the questions until the end. I'm going to now ask Martha Weatherspoon to share a little bit from a resident's perspective, as in a resident's leader's perspective.
This should be good. Okay, first of all, let's clarify something, because somebody asked why do I have a fan. I have a fan because I'm going through menopause and hot flashes, so if y'all don't want me to sit up here look like I've been swimming, leave me and my fan alone. Okay. Sorry, Paul. Okay, to continue. I will give you a brief, I always tell this story because people find it fascinating, because they say, why are you in public housing? The reason, public housing was a choice. I went through a divorce. At the time, my daughter was 12 years old. We had the option to go home. Home is in Florida. But being a military wife, traveling all over the world, she knew family, but she didn't know nobody. So the choice was, do we stay, do we go? At the time, Martha wanted peace, because I was on the verge of killing somebody, but you know, God relieved me from that. But I wanted peace, and my mama always told us that she was going to have peace if she had to live on the tree. So I chose to go into public housing. We were still working, but Martha had a plan. It wasn't God's plan, but it was Martha's plan, because in 2 years, Martha was leaving. You wasn't going to tell me anything. 2 years came, had the money ready to go, bam, door closed. Car just died for no reason at all. And so I'm a very strong-willed person, and I was standing my ground. So God and I had a conversation like we are, He's real, I can talk to him just like I talk to anybody else. And my question was, what have I done that was so bad that you would keep me here? I just needed to know, because I have searched, and I know I have cursed a lot of people. I knew that. I know I've been rude to some people, but people have killed and moved on, and you are holding me here. That's how I felt. And so a couple months later, I was getting ready to go to work, and the voice said, until you do what I have told you. And I'm like, well, I'm not dumb, but I'm like, well, what did you tell me? Because I'm being honest, because you have to have that ear to hear. And Martha had an ear, but I wasn't hearing what he was saying because I was so content on moving on. That was my focus, because I didn't grow up in public housing, heard bad things about it. That was off limit. My mom said, no, no, no. And if she was here today, she would say I was doing this to punish her, but it has nothing to do with her. And I was thinking, and I was getting ready to go somewhere, but I had to walk up the street, and I looked in this yard, and I was just like, where's the love? Where is the love? This is not a trash dump. Where is the love? So I came back. I was in church. I'm like, okay, whatever you want, I'll do. Just tell me what you want, which I should have never said that. Because on that Tuesday, I get a letter. Miss Weatherspoon, how would you like to go to Richmond, Virginia, to a conference on public housing? But I went. Thank God I went, because I did not know you can do so much in public housing. I heard all the bad things, but never nothing good until I went to Richmond. So it's been 12 years, and I always say thank God for my journey, because I have met people that I have never met before. I have talked to people that I would never have talked to before, because if you was not in the education or the financial field, then we had nothing to talk about. But since I am in Lincoln Home, and for the people in public housing, the question becomes, this is your home. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to fight for it? Are you going to let it be taken away? And as a leader, it's time for you to do your due diligence. When I say due diligence, I mean go to work. I mean, HUD's story. They put the information out there. What are you going to do with the information? A lot of people say, well, I'm waiting for HUD to come and tell us. What are they going to tell you? It's already out there. But your job as leaders, as residents, is your job to tell them. Let's pick up the paperwork, let's read it, let's analyze it. Let's put it in a point of view that you can understand, that you would be able to go and talk with your people. See, now in Clarksville, Tennessee, most people refer to me as the mafia. Don't ask me why, but the thing is, you can call a person. My thing is do due diligence. If I got a problem, if I cannot solve that problem, with the military, there's a chain of command. So I follow that command until that command does not prove useful. Then I just find somebody else and I just go over your head. So when Trump budget came out, people read it. Public housing residents were like, doesn't matter to us. They're going to do what they want to do. But no, we can't do what you want to do anymore. So the point was, Tennessee is a red state. Let's point that out very clear, because they helped Trump get into office. But when they was helping Trump get into office, they did not know it would backfire on them. Because, we're just going to hurt the poor. No, if you're not a part of that 1%, you are getting hurt too. So it comes down to the point. Residents, do your due diligence. Get their names. Find your state legislator. Find their name. Get their phone number and start calling. You got email. Start emailing to the point. They cannot turn down your phone call. They have to listen to it. They have to record it. But if you get enough people calling, you will make the Republican think. Marsha Blackburn, Nashville, Tennessee, strictly Republican. But after Trump budget came out and people started calling and sending emails, she had to go back and rethink her position. Because Martha's position is very clear. A vote put you in office, and a vote will take you out of office. And the point is for public housing residents, if you feel within your city, if you are not being represented properly, then find somebody that you would trust to recommend and put them up for a vote. They can be on the city council because it was done in Clarksville when the Asian community felt like they wasn't being supported. So they found this guy, Robert, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the last name. It starts with the N. But it was enough of them to put him in the city council so he can take care of his district. And so with public housing, we have to figure out, this is our home. This is where you're going to raise your family at. You want them to be safe. You want them to be loved. But it is time as residents and as leaders that we pick up the mantle and do what we're supposed to do. And all this, I'm going to wait for the next person, that mentality got to go. It's time for you to do something. You know, the old folks had a saying, you can get, that's on the part you need to get off. But the thing is, we need to rise. We've been down too long. Why haven't we got up? Because we keep saying, I'm waiting. Who are we waiting for? You got leaders. And the thing is, in being a leader, and Jordan know this, you do the best you can, but you still got your haters that's sitting over saying, well, who does she think she are? What is she doing? My question is, what are you doing? See, because I'm in my office every day at 9 a.m., and sometimes I don't leave until 8 p.m., but I am there. And they say, well, they're not working. Well, just because you don't see it does not mean we're not working. So, but it's time for residents. It's time for the leaders. Do due diligence. You need to go back home and set a fire under your people, or maybe your people need to set a fire under you. If the leader is the problem, move them. You can't move the resident, but you can move the leaders. And for those who are hating on you, then call them out. Because we got to move one way or the other, and it's time to rise. And I was brought up, and my father would tell you, he always told us, if you fall on your back, that way you're always looking up. But my brother came in, the good pastor came back after Daddy's dead, to give his point. And he said, well, sis, he said sometimes people fall flat on the face. I said, roll over. roll over. They say misery loves company, but Martha doesn't love company. Because I tell them in Lincoln Homes, if you are in a ditch, if that person cannot get you out, why the devil you want him to jump in and keep you company? See, the point is, we got to move forward. We've been stuck too long. Get up, do something. If you have to work by yourself, then work by yourself. Do it yourself. But we must remove that negativity mindset that we have. Public housing, living on the western side of town, a house is just that, a house. It doesn't make you, it doesn't break you. But the only difference, one side have a whole lot of love, and public housing doesn't. So when we find the love, then we can incorporate, we can move on. If it's just meeting, Michael, pick up the trash in front of your door. We don't want to see this trash anymore. Public housing has this bad perception that's been going on for years and years. In Clarksville, first 5 years I worked on trying to change the perception, which I find interested with rich, no pun intended, white folks. They're just rich white folks because they say, well, she don't know where she at. That woman done lost her mind. She's over there in this area. So, but my thing is, I don't know you, you don't know me, so well, let's have an introduction. Everybody in Tennessee know I love to cook. I don't cook because it's just only me, but I love to cook. So my thing is, I will call you, introduce myself to you. Then I will follow up with a letter. Then you would call me back and they would say, well, first what they do in Clarksville, they research you. If they're going to get killed, they have to let everybody know where they're coming to get killed. and so they research it and they come. And I have had more congressional leaders in Lincoln Home in my office because we're having lunch. Because they say with good food, good conversation, you can work something out. And so if you ever come to Tennessee, you'll meet Representative Joe Pitts, who's on the state letter. And he always tell people, he said, well, did y'all get that invitation for Martha? And they're like, yep. He said, y'all came. Okay, I said, yes, sir, we was invited. He said, yes, sir, what Martha said, you're going to come or else. I'm like, why do you tell people that? But we have learned to work together because I'll leave you with this thought. My office is next door to a house, but there's a parking structure. The lady has grown sons. During the summertime, they sit out there and they drink their beer and everything else. But in my office, I did a library, so I was collecting books. I had two ladies come over, and they ran in the building. Oh, my God, Martha, shouldn't you be afraid? So afraid of what? So I looked at it, then I saw it was Calvin and his brothers and stuff. I was like, no, ma'am. I said, ma'am, that is my security. Let them drink. And I tell you this for a reason. As long as they are drinking, I can leave. I'm in D.C. right now. I can leave, but I can go back, and they can tell me who came over, what time he came, how long. They can give a perfect description. But if they are sober, they cannot help anybody. So I say, let them drink. So just leave them alone, because it comes down to how you talk to people. Everybody want to be with respect. We got drug dealers on the corner, but if Martha's using the playground on a Saturday, so I'm like, hey man, what you doing? You made any money today? They're like, oh, Miss Martha, made any money? Well, no. So, well, let's go work for free. Saturday, 8 o'clock, I need these tables set up, these tents, so I will feed you. So whatever food is left, you can take with you. Okay. People show up and they're like, what they doing here? Well, they here the same way you are here. You know, they came to work. They came to listen. And lastly, go back and tell your single mothers, stop having all these babies. You know, we got to cut that out too. Go back to school. It's time to go back to school. Go back to school. Get a degree. Public housing should be just like the jail cells used to be. Go to prison, you can get you a 4-year degree. Stay in public housing, get a 4-year degree. I'm serious. I'm done.
I thought I was waiting for the mic drop, right?
My perspective, public housing, as someone who was the director of the public housing program at HUD for 7 years, right, and continuing to work in this industry to make sure that folks just like Martha and others who live in public housing who need deeply affordable housing have a place to live, right? And how do we make sure that that's happening? And what do I see coming down the pike with this administration? I can talk about that. Okay. Okay. So in many ways, and this probably won't be popular, right? But I think the public housing program, if it's not failing, right, it certainly has a really pronounced limp, right? The funding and regulatory environment make it extremely difficult to invest in the units, right, to ensure that they're viable as part of the country's long-term affordable housing infrastructure. And make no bones about it, public housing is infrastructure. It's at the very core of why the program was created in the first place, right? The federal government saw that substandard housing was the only thing available, so they went in and created this, what they saw to be a fundamental housing system for the nation. So the notion that that affordable housing or public housing is infrastructure as a gimmick, it's not true. That's the entire core of why it was developed in the first place. And so my concern or fear is that this administration will hasten the demise of public housing, whether intentionally or otherwise, and I think that that would be tragic. You know, for years, everyone focused on mobility and they focused on the voucher program. But the truth is that you're always going to need both, right? You're always going to need hard units as a housing solution, and I think the tenant vouchers are an extremely good strategy as well, but you need both. And so no matter what you call it, right, public housing, or in the future, it's a generic affordable housing, or if everything converts to a Section 8 platform, right, a funding strategy, every effort needs to be made to preserve those 1.1 million units around the country. And whatever tools are necessary, we need to have the freedom to use them. So the likeliest solution that I see coming down the pike from my perspective, and I think it's a viable one, right, is the full conversion of public housing to a Section 8 funding platform. But it has to come with appropriate funding. And under the current RAD structure, that's not the case, right? Without full Section 8 funding, essentially what you're doing is you're setting up these units for a cycle, right? Where you invest, they decline, there's deterioration, right? They near obsolescence, and then somebody says, let's put some money back into this. But every time units go through that cycle, you lose more and more, right? And so what I expect to see from this administration, and I don't think that there is any doubt, public housing is in its crosshairs, right? Well, I understand, right, the president's budget, it's really a political statement. Every president's budget is a political statement. But this administration's skinny budget was absolutely clear. It has little intention of supporting public housing over the next 4 years. That's what I read. And what I expect we'll see in the very near future is first and foremost work requirements and/or term limits introduced. Right? Paul Ryan has already introduced this just in June of 2016, right, through his Better Way plan. He proposed both work requirements and term limits, similar to what's happening with TANF, and he also proposed closing any loopholes, right, that would allow a community to look at the reality of that scenario, right? Does it work? To take the opportunity that Chicago has used, right, which is more of a mechanism to get people into services, get them connected to services and supports, and instead use it as a hammer. And so having that from a federal level as a legislative solution, I think, is punitive and problematic. Second, I expect that we'll continue to see minuscule budgets, and I think that Diane was absolutely correct this morning when she said the problem with even having those proposed cuts as a political statement in a president's budget is that it makes this feel so much better than this, right? And that's not a win for the programs, whether it's Section 8 public housing or whatever it ends up being called. I also expect that we'll see significant streamlining within the program. And I don't necessarily think that that is a bad thing. I'm sorry. Okay. I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that there is an opportunity to make improvements to reduce some of the administrative requirements that make the program expensive to operate. But also that make it and you can do it in ways that don't undermine the program's purpose, right, of providing deeply affordable housing. Instead, regulatory reform can focus on the streamlining these administrative requirements. The good thing about the administration's skinny budget is that it is purely political, right? Where the rubber really meets the road is with Congress. And what I'm hearing from appropriators is that the skinny budget is dead on arrival, right, which is a good thing. So the place where our voices need to be heard to make sure affordable housing programs and public housing are funded and to fight against punitive policies is working directly with Congress. With regard to the work requirements, I have to say, I've now heard Secretary Carson speak twice. And each time he talks about how he grew up. He speaks very tenderly about being raised by his single mother, right, who worked as a domestic, cared for 2 sons, and how she struggled to provide for them. Now, he's a neurosurgeon, his brother is a rocket scientist, and they're both extremely accomplished in their own right. But what I've thought each time I've heard him speak is that your mother needed rental assistance, just like mine, right? And she needed deep rental assistance. Needing or accepting assistance wouldn't have made his mother a bad mother, and it certainly didn't make my mother a bad mother. And at some point, I hope he looks at his personal story as more than just bootstraps and sees the fact that there's another kid growing up poor who could turn out to be a neurosurgeon or a rocket scientist or a houser like he is today, as long as their basic needs are met. And that so I worked at the federal level and now I work at the local level, and we have to figure out how to solve these problems on the ground. And I'll tell you that one of the fatal flaws of the program, that in my opinion, has been that it started as a real estate development program, right? But very quickly, it became entirely divorced from best practices and what it meant to maintain real property, right? And worse, its deterioration somehow came to reflect what was good enough, right, for residents. And the condition of the housing became a metaphor about people, right? Somehow a poor program design became an indictment of residents who happened to make less money and needed rental assistance. Well, you know, the reality is it is real estate, right? Housing authorities need to be able to fully exploit whatever range of financing tools are out there available to create and maintain public and other affordable housing, right? And that means also generating revenue that is less reliant on federal subsidy. However, be clear, that only gets you so far, right? To get to 30% of AMI, right, and below, you're generally going to need ongoing federal subsidy. And at the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, which is where I work, right, it's right outside of DC, we're fortunate as an agency, right? We have a wide range of tools immediately at our disposal. HOC is not only a housing authority, but it also functions as a housing finance agency. That means that we get to not only issue our own bonds, right, support the development of our projects, but it helps us finance non-HOC owned affordable housing developments. That allows us to not only help increase the supply across the county, but generate revenue so that HOC can serve even more households. And when the federal budget for the public housing program is short, right, that creates a bit of a backfill. As an agency, we're at the final stages of a full public housing conversion under RAD. And one of the strategies that we've used as part of our conversion, and I say our, but I just got there like a year ago, so, but I'll just go ahead and take all that. One of the things that we've done as part of our conversion is that where there was an opportunity to deconcentrate the units, we used it. And partially, that was necessary because remember, RAD funding isn't full funding. It only keeps you at the same public housing funding level. And if it wasn't enough before, it doesn't magically become enough afterwards, right? So we've used the RAD opportunity to rehabilitate or redevelop in exactly the same way we develop any other affordable housing that's in our portfolio, and most of which may not include a federal subsidy. So we do create mixed income properties that have both market rate and affordable units. In this way, what happens is that we're able to use the rents from the market rate units to help pay for and make the other units affordable, right? And essentially, the program is internally subsidized. What that does in our non-RAD developments, typically we're able to get to about a 70-30 or a 60-40 split, with 30% or up to 40% of the units being affordable to low-income households. In addition, HOC has been innovative in that we've recently broken ground on a mixed income development within Chevy Chase, Maryland. And Chevy Chase, Maryland is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country, right? So we just broke ground on a new affordable housing, mixed income affordable housing development that includes private equity in the transaction. And that equity was provided by the Gwendolyn and Morris Cafritz Foundation. This may be the very first time in history that an affordable housing development included private equity within the transaction while the PHA maintained ownership control, right? It hasn't happened, and everyone's looking for ways to make it happen, and we were able to do it. Again, I just got there, but I'll just tell you all that, right? And I think that's the fear, right? That with increased public-private partnerships, housing authorities will lose control of their public housing units, right? And it becomes a windfall for private developers. That doesn't have to happen, right? And partnerships certainly don't mean that housing authorities lose their identity. They were created as housers with a mission, right? And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Certainly, as they gain more experience in creating these and doing more redevelopment of their public housing properties. The challenge for all of us as housers and advocates is to be vigilant, right? To test new approaches and hopefully work with the administration to implement policy solutions that hold the greatest promise. Going forward, I think the public housing program needs to be able to access the full range of financing tools and resources that are available to the private real estate and explore new ways, and I look forward to being part of those solutions. I try.
Pristin, if you could share with us. Here for questions. We have about 15 minutes, but if you could keep yours to about 5, great.
Sure. Sure. Is my microphone working?
You want to try to?
Does it work? Is the microphone working now? Hello? All right. So I'll just start off with talking loud. So I know that there are a lot of folks here from New York. I see a lot of familiar faces, so that's great. I just wanted to start to give with a brief picture of the Public Housing Authority, just so folks get a sense of who we are and what we are. We're about 175,000 units of public housing. We serve about 400,000 residents, and our average rent goes between about $400 to $600 on average a month. And that's in context, in comparison to what we're seeing in New York City, where we have, I think some of the same issues that a lot of high-cost cities have, where we have a vacancy rate that's under 4%, and it's actually, I think, 1.8% for units that are under $800 a month. And so we face a lot of challenges, and similar to a lot of other public housing authorities, we have seen long years and years of divestment from the federal government over the last couple of decades, which has led to a lot of negative conditions that our residents live in. We have $17 billion worth of capital needs across our portfolio. So it's within that context that when Mayor de Blasio and my boss, Shauna Olatoye, was made chair of the Public Housing Authority, that was the situation we were facing. I think the one difference that we had coming up, in the years, right leading up to the election, was something that I think we, Miss Weatherspoon talked a lot about, as far as the importance around resident engagement and resident and community advocacy around public housing. The one thing that we saw that was pretty significant was our resident leaders and the advocacy groups, some of them who are in the room today, made public housing a priority. They built a really huge campaign around public housing and making sure that it was on the agenda for the mayoral election. They actually forced all the mayoral candidates to sleep in public housing, spend a night in public housing, so they could actually see the situation that residents are living in. And I think that was significant, because when Mayor de Blasio came into office, public housing became a real priority, and as a result, when he asked Shauna to create a plan to preserve public housing, it got a lot. It wasn't just a report that sat on a desk or on a bookshelf. It actually things started to go into action, and we started seeing some real movement with continued support from our residents. So we saw, for the first time in nearly 20 years, we saw investments from the city and state. And the city investment now is up to over $1 billion now to add to our capital program. They started relieving us of payments that we had been making to the city that were for various services that no other landlord usually makes. And the state, for the first time, started making some major investments in public housing. So we continue using these investments and also utilizing other strategies, working with HUD closely with things like RAD to try and address the $17 billion capital need. And I think it's resident engagement. It's a continual effort to continue to do a better job in making sure that folks understand the path and the direction we're going in, and that folks feel comfortable, because change is challenging. But with RAD, which is something we got in late to the game because we do have such a strong resident and advocate community, there was a lot of concern about transitioning over to RAD. But working with folks like Legal Aid Society, Legal Aid, with other community advocates, with residents who we brought together as a part of a working group, we got folks to say, well, what are the concerns that you have? Is it, was stuff about secession rights? Will we be, what's going to happen with charges around electrical bills and other things? And through that, we created a document that's, I think it's 20 some odd pages that went through and kind of addressed all the resident and advocates' concerns. So that way, folks would start feeling more comfortable. And at this point now, I think it's night and day. When we were having the conversations in the previous administration to today, the conversations are entirely different. Residents are coming to us frequently and kind of starting to understand that that is the only place where there is really sufficient resources to significantly change residents' lives and the way that their apartments look and feel. So, we just closed our first RAD deal for 1,400 units in the Rockaways, which was an area that was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. But we closed the deal, and we have we're going to have $325 million invested into that development, and residents are going to have brand new kitchens, bathrooms, common spaces. All the electrical boilers and kind of the guts of the building are all going to be redone. And we think through, we've kind of dipped our toes in, and we're going to work hard to try and build the trust and continue to have that trust of the residents in that development. We're hoping that that will be a place where we can then bring folks and see that I think, as Shauna was saying, that things change, but the fundamental core of the mission and the way that residents will be treated and served will essentially be the same, and the protections and rights of folks will be the same. So, as far as the challenges we're facing, I think people have spoken to them. The skinny budget, for us, we're looking at, if the skinny budget came to fruition, we're looking at about $150 million in cuts to our operating, and a 2/3 cut to our capital program. So that'd be from $300 million to $100 million, which is we were challenged to begin with. It would be really challenging. That's all I can say. But I think that we've been speaking and having lots of conversations across the country because we realize that New York can't do it on its own. We've got a great delegation, but we've only got one Republican member of Congress. So we've started talking to public housing authorities across the country. And last week, Shauna spoke at the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials to a room of about 900 housing officials from across the country. And we talked about the need to work together to try and ensure and really educate folks about the connection between adequate funding levels and serving our residents and creating and making sure that they have a healthy, safe environment to be living in. And people got really excited about that. And I think that the one place that we see some optimism potentially is, look, Dr. Carson is a doctor, and we believe that one of the first rules for doctors is do no harm. And I think that as housers, we believe that our job in providing safe, affordable, housing and healthy housing is also about doing no harm. And we feel that that is a place where we can join and have a conversation where we will hopefully be speaking the same language.
Fantastic. Okay, every one of our panelists was fantastic, really compelling. We only have a few minutes, so we probably will be able to take about 2 questions. We'll start over here, gentleman here.
Thanks, Lane. I was hoping the panel could speak a little bit about the Moving to Work program.
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, sorry. Curtis Stauffer, Louisville, Kentucky. The Moving to Work program has been, in terms of making regulatory reductions, very innovative. There have been some promising practices that emerged from it, but there's been a lot of troubling things too, particularly the diversion of voucher funds, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of units annually. Thinking particularly about Chicago, where they sat on over $400 million of unspent cash and diverted over $100 million a year away from the voucher program. And there's been a big push over the last few years to expand Moving to Work and the models that it proposes. What can we do as advocates as this push continues to ensure that the maximum amount of funding is going to the ground to serve people in need rather than being diverted away from resources and leaving units vacant and vouchers unused?
Anybody want to tackle that?
I can talk a little bit about Chicago.
Okay.
I'm not speaking for the Housing Authority, so I'm an observer. I know that some of what happened was what I talked about was the change in administration and sort of the pullback from civic advocacy at the Housing Authority. I think the MTW has been, had both positives and negatives. I think the positive that I see in Chicago is the ability to spend $40 million a year on resident services, which they couldn't do without that ability. Obviously, I worry about, why were they not moving forward and spending the money for the redevelopment and getting new housing online. I think that's starting to happen now under the new administration, but there was a long pause. I see a lot of housing authorities trying to use the funds to bring services into public housing because it's very difficult to get service providers to come in and serve their residents, and there aren't enough services in the community. So the more that they are able to use their funds to partner, I think the better off the residents are. I think it's a balancing act. They're gonna, they need some flexibility, but you're right, they need to be preserving the housing, especially in this affordable housing crisis that we're in.
We'll go to another question, right here in pink and pink. We'll get a mic to you.
Valerie Bouchard from Sarasota, Florida. And my question is, since we have such little time, how can they propose term limits for residents when the pay is not being increased? And being able to afford to rent outside of public housing? How can they impose term limits on families when the pay is just not increasing? Are you to work 2 or 3 jobs and never live at home? Or, can you speak to that, please?
I think that it would be a tremendous mistake, right? Whether it's time limits or work requirements. The reality is we live in a capitalist market, right? That means we don't have an environment for full employment. Even if we did, right, we don't have enough housing to support folks where they are, right? And or at affordable level. So I think it would simply be a mistake. How can they propose it? I hope they don't. But they, in some ways they have already. And so now it's time to be vocal about what the impacts of that would be, because essentially you would have housing programs making people homeless.
Okay, we have a very tight schedule before Dr. Carson comes, so I'm afraid we're going to have to hold off on any further questions for this session. I just want to say, I like to take notes, and particularly quotes and statistics, but I have just filled up my piece of paper here. I thought this panel was absolutely fantastic. Thank you all so much for doing what you've done.